There's no context around these. It's a snapshot. You put it out there. It's almost like, you plant the seed, you take a step back. What's Vincent Kompany like? Is that typically what you would expect from the gaffer during your time at Burnley?
Vinny was.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Premier Injuries Podcast. Now, today, I'm joined by a fantastic guest. It's innovation and performance coach, David Rhodes. Thanks, David. And how are you?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you for the invite, Ben.
Yeah, for those that don't know David has an extensive CV, 20 plus years in working in elite sport, primarily football from your early days in 2003, where you started off with Chorley, moving to the likes of Salford, had a little spell at Everton, even done some external work for the Premier League, went across the border into Motherwell. But it's your most recent role that I would like to focus on at Burnley, if that's okay with you, David. And just a little bit, and I suppose it's very topical given the news that came out in recent days with regards to some video footage showing Vincent Kompany and shall we say just a heated disagreement maybe with Johann, Berg, Gudmundsson. And so I'd like to say, what's Vincent Kompany like, working with on a day-to-day basis? Is that typically what you would expect from the gaffer during your time at Burnley?
Vinny was a great guy, absolutely fantastic guy. I don't think the footage reflects him as a manager, in essence, in terms of the fact that he is very patient, very calm, very collected. I've never worked with anybody with as much detail from a coaching and management perspective as Vinny. He was so articulate in everything that he did. Everything had purpose and everything centered around these players and what he wanted his players to do on the pitch. Obviously, in football, there's always frustrations and there's times of frustrations. And at the time, the clip that's gone live, I haven't seen it actually, which I have to say that out. At this point, I haven't seen it, only seen the social media and the news and bits and pieces that have gone around it. But at the time, obviously, we were struggling. We were in a relegation battle. And Vinny demanded high standards of his players, and I'm sure he's doing that at Bayern Munich now. He was always demanding of his players, of his staff. The hours that Vinny worked were, relentless. He would be the first one in the building at 7 o'clock in the morning, the last one to leave, and sometimes midnight. He would be out of the building. So if he wasn't getting those high standards at a time when it was, a difficult moment in terms of relegation, then sometimes things spill over and frustrations build. And I think that's all it was really. What the clip probably doesn't show is, them kissing and making up very shortly after. It was done and dusted within 2 or 3 minutes after the event and the training session. So I'm sure it's been cleverly edited for TV and to get some viewers.
Exactly that, isn't it? Because it's always, there's no context around these. It's a snapshot, a moment in time that's captured. You put it out there. It's almost like, you plant the seed, you take a step back, and then everybody else sort of takes control. So I want to take a little bit of a step back from the mission to sort of Burnley documentary and go back to, was it the summer of 22 where Vincent Kompany took charge of Burnley, and then a few months later, I think around about the September time, sort of you come into post, and at that point you had been involved with the Premier League. Of course, you had been involved with Motherwell, and there will be a point where this all sort of comes together. But you arrived sort of fairly late on the scene at Burnley. That pre-season program had been done. Life in the Championship had already started. So what was that like, and how did that that opportunity to work down at Turf Moor come about?
So yeah, it was a strange one really. I was up at Motherwell. I'd finished pre-season up there more or less, and then there was a change of manager up there. I always kind of went to Motherwell. It was always a short-term role. Really, it was to help a previous manager out that I'd worked under. In essence, there was things that he needed help with up there. Did that. Ended up doing 18 months there. Left, and actually didn't really have many plans of doing too much after I'd left Motherwell. It was kind of like, enjoy the break. But within a week, I think it was, I got a phone call from Burnley to go in, meet the head fitness coach at the time, which was Bram Gears. Great guy. A lot of time for Bram. He's gone to Bayern with Vinny. He was at Anderlecht with him. And then subsequent conversation with Vinny, which, it was scheduled to be a half an hour conversation. And like I say, referring back to Vinny's detail, 4 hours later, you're still in the room with Vinny, still discussing, the ins and outs and ups and downs of what we do and how we do it. And it just went from there. It spiraled from there, really. It was... it all went very quickly because initially it was to go in and do some consultancy stuff, and then it just evolved very quickly. And then before you know it, you're in full time. And I always say football's like quicksand. You step in at your ankles, and before you know it, you're up to your shoulders and your neck. And that was very much that scenario there.
Yeah, it's the job title that interests me, and then subsequently what happened, towards the sort of back end of that season, that innovation and performance. And given what you've mentioned about Vincent Kompany and how meticulous he is and how he, likes to plan things and his philosophies, do you think the appeal and the attraction was, we've seen from your record, you've went down into South, everywhere you go, availability rates of the squad generally has been on the increase. You have proven records of success in every club that you've been to. Do you think that was the appeal with Vinny, and he really wanted to sort of dig deeper and find out about what your thoughts and what you could do, and in terms of improving it and moving Burnley on to, at that point, from a championship team to really push forward and push for promotion to the Premier League?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it was very strange at Burnley in a lot of respects, and I've seen it at other clubs as well. But Vinny was the heartbeat of the football club, and actually only when he left did you realise how much he stuck the club together. And he was meticulous in everything. He had oversight over everything: analysis, recruitment, medical and performance. Every aspect of the kitchen, every aspect of that football club. And he engaged with everybody within the football club in terms of, right through to the kitchen staff, through to the cleaning staff that came in the evenings, because Vinny was always sat at his desk. You could see him, you'd be speaking to and engaging with those people. So in terms of that, my opinion, and, Vinny sat here, might say different, but my opinion is that Vinny did an analysis of the football club when he came in. He picked it up at a very difficult time. They'd just been relegated. They lost unprecedented amounts of players. He had to build a new squad, literally, from the June when he walked into pre-season to then kick into gear for the season starting. And when you talk to him and his staff about that, that was a difficult task for them to do. But throughout that period as well, that we were constantly evaluating every aspect, and what Vinny drove and pushed for was everything to centre around the football pitch. Everything being, and we use this terminology of football-centric, everything was football-centric, which really aligned with me and my personal thoughts and how I build my processes around, what we do in the gym or what we do in the medical room, what we do in the treatment room. It's the fact that I always work back from what does the manager need that player to do? What does that manager need that winger to do? And then we work back, because I speak to the staff a lot about this in every club that I've been in. We can't do everything, because if we could do everything that we wanted to do with players, the players wouldn't play football. And the most important thing is these players playing football, in essence, because if the team aren't winning games and you're not challenging in the right aspects and relative to where your club's at, and then the finance changes. Relegation for Burnley at the time changed the finance picture. I'm sure that we'll probably see some player sales over the next few weeks, because that's the nature of the game. You see it with every team that gets relegated. They need to balance the books, and financial fair play obviously impacts that as well. So winning games is the most important thing. So we have to center everything around that. And how do we best prepare players? How do we develop players? How do we help players steer clear of injury? And that is, if there was a book to follow, it would be easy. It's different for every player and every individual, even within ages. And so making things football centric is what Vinny was all about, and that's what aligned with me. And that was my attraction to Burnley Football Club at the time, is because I could see the way that he spoke about his journey and what he wanted to do. And he had a 5-year plan, even though he was only there 2. Nobody's going to turn down Bayern Munich when they come in and they offer you a role. But, it was the vision of what he wanted to do. And that was a massive attraction for me to step into that role.
And to kind of phrase that, I picked up that you used, I think it was on a LinkedIn post, that one human performance department, about bringing in that collaborative approach from the doctors, the psychologists, your nutrition, your R&D. Was that just about, providing this holistic overview to applying for players to, ultimately your goal is always going to be that 3 points, but it's to perform at a certain level and also, keep your players fit and healthy and available to go out on the pitch.
Yeah, I mean, listen, what gets lost sometimes is we're there as support staff. We're there purely to support the team and the coaching staff, and in terms of getting the best out of that group of players, and that can come in a lot of different ways. That might be developing a player, that might be keeping a player available, that might be maintaining a player. At Burnley at the time, we had a lot of young players that had come in from different leagues around Europe that were nowhere near the demands of the Premier League. And we know how fast and furious the Premier League has become. And there's been lots of work published, some I've been involved with, in terms of the demands of the Premier League and how that's increased over the last decade. So there's so many considerations in terms of things that you need to think about with players and supporting. But the first thing is to just kind of accept that you are a performance support team. You're there to support. You're not the main event. You're not there to, be the people in the spotlight. You're there to help, in essence. So the idea behind human performance and this human performance support team is like everybody. If you ask everybody in a support team and a performance team, what are they there to do? They're there to help the team be better. Everybody would say the same thing. But what I've seen over the last 12 years, particularly in terms of going into leadership roles, is there's so much conflict within those teams. And every role that I've stepped into leading, I've stepped into a room of conflict. And that conflict usually comes about because, and I hear this word a lot, and it's something I've got a little bit of an issue with, is ego. Everybody's got an ego. Everybody has an ego. I've got an ego because it's what drives us to be better. It's what drives us to be the best in what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. What some people don't have is humility. And I think that is the most important thing, because to make one athlete good and to make, one athlete perform at their very optimal level, they need everybody in that building. Everybody has a purpose in that building, from a doctor to the nutritionist to the strength and conditioner to the physios to the rehab specialist. Whatever it is in that building, they have all got a role to play with helping this player stay on the pitch and play at and perform at their top level. Now, I've seen, to give an example of it, I think I've used this a couple of times, but ultimately, I've sat in rooms where physios and sports science, or medical and sports science, have been at conflict. And usually that conflict comes about because of communication. And we talk about communication a lot, and everybody will say good communication is key. Easy to say, the hardest thing to achieve. I've sat in conversations where a strength and conditioners turned around and said, "Oh, we need to make them work harder, or we need to get them doing more in the gym." And you can see the fear on the physio's face, because we have strength and conditioners, sports scientists who will always push the bar and will always want this optimal level of work, and even sometimes beyond. And the physios are always concerned about the player, the welfare of the player, the injury, the history of injury, etc. So when they hear that, they go straight away into overdrive of going, "Oh, we need to protect that knee, or we need to protect that muscle," because they're prone to those things. And equally, a physio could sit there and go, "Oh, the load's too high," which drives a sports scientist or a strength and conditioner mad, because they're going, "What do you mean by load? What does that actually mean?" But somewhere in between, there's a bar, and that's where they need to come together and meet. And that's what I've always tried to focus my job on, is try to get those people connecting. So I see, and this is kind of going around the houses a little bit, my vision is how does the medical room support what the player has to do to go on into the, it depends on the pathway of your player's journey in the day, but traditionally we would have a day that would look like players would report in, there would be some kind of treatment or assessment that goes on in the morning, they transition into the gym for the training prep, then they go out and train. So how do those three things connect? What is the physio doing specifically with that player, whether it's some soft tissue work, whether it's some mobilization of the joint, whether it's some electrotherapy, whatever it is, whether it's just a general mobility, whatever they're doing in the treatment room or around the reformers or whatever else is in the building, how does that then prepare them for what the S&C coach needs them to do in the gym? And how does that prepare them for the pitch? And how we planned that was go backwards, right? What are they doing on the pitch today? Right, okay, that's going to dictate what happens with the S&C coach in the gym. That's then going to drive what the physios need to do to make sure this player's prepped, and the soft tissue therapist. So it's about linking those things together, but putting your processes together, and it's so important. I remember one member of staff in a previous club, one member of staff turned around to me and said, "All my processes are in my head." And I was like, "Yeah, but how does that help the rest of the team?" It's great that you've got processes in your head, but we need to map those out, because they need to align to the other things. And there's lots of examples of that, and I could talk to the cows come home about examples of that in roles that I've been in. But the importance is making sure everything links, because if it doesn't, you're going to get contrasting information. You're going to get conflict from the player going, "Oh, well, I don't really need to do that. I shouldn't be doing this, shouldn't be doing that." And you do see that in teams and environments where, staff will indirectly, I genuinely don't believe that 99% of the time that staff don't mean to undermine each other. But sometimes in the language that they use with the player, they do undermine. And then it causes conflict, and players ultimately then refusing to do things or wanting a bit more rationale around why they're doing it. So getting your processes down on paper and making sure they align to the pitch is the key thing. And then the outcome then takes care of itself.
So you made a point there, and I just want to sort of pick up on that. You talk about the difficulties in managing a multidisciplinary team, maybe different objectives, or maybe different ways of maybe wanting to manage players. And you said that once Vinny left, you only realized how much he held things together once he was actually gone. And going back to sort of towards the end of May and early June, I was reading some of your posts, and at that point there was there was no suggestion about looking back, or this is the end of the road. It was talking about the future. It was welcoming new staff into the team. Yes, it had been a disappointing season in terms of the relegation back down to the second tier of football, but everything sort of seemed to point towards that that continuation of that role within the club would go on. As we speak now, you're no longer associated with Burnley down at the club. Was that maybe as a little bit of a fallout from some sort of Vinny leaving to go to Bayern Munich, and that maybe that that conflicting issues maybe creeping back in, that Vinny was able to sort of maybe oversee and manage effectively during his time there?
Yeah, I mean, Vinny didn't really get involved with too much in terms of the day-to-days and the how we went about things. He was always abreast of things, but he was never micromanaged, or never, he was never on a daily basis in there sorting things out. Our daily routine would look probably like most clubs that I've been in, is that you go in, you have a meeting with the manager in the morning, you update him on player availability, things to be aware of, things not to worry about. Then you go into your daily role. I think looking back and reflecting into the off season, which ultimately was, we had the last game of the season at home, and like most clubs, at the end of that game, there was a drink and a bit of food, and families were present and all that stuff, and there was lots of conversations. Players left, and and there was a couple of staff leaving anyway. They'd gone to new roles, so there was all of that kind of celebration and thank you for all your hard work. And I don't think nobody expected what was coming, in essence, in the fact that I remember I was just at home preparing to go away on holiday. It was like 3 days before I went away, and I was getting texts off friends going, "Oh, well, you have to Bayern Munich then, are you?" And I was like, what are they going on about? What's everybody talking about here? So like, because I don't really see too much news or press or read too much around stuff. And so I was like, and then they're sending me the Sky Sports of Vinny's being linked with Bayern Munich and all that stuff. And then I went away on the Saturday, and that's when it kicked off. In essence, it started to get momentum and wheels, and then all of a sudden, you have conversations and phone calls are made, and the realization is that he's going. And at that time, it went very quiet at the club. There was very little conversation with any staff. There was lots of staff ringing me. There was me contacting people that I knew were involved in the Bayern Munich thing and discussions, and inevitably it came 10 days later that he was there and he'd signed and he'd gone. And I think then there was so much uncertainty at that time in the club, and then it just, as football does, it changes. The landscape changes very, very quickly, and people come in with different ideas and different directions and wanting to move in different directions. Budgets change, so there's lots of facets to it. But there was no fallout. There's no hard feelings. I had a great time at Burnley for 2 years. Really enjoyed my time there. There was difficult moments, of course. There was, with like in any elite sport environment, the highs are highs and the lows are lows, and there's nothing in between. But yeah, I look back with it fondly, but we all move on, and it's a bit of a cliche in football, but yeah, we do. We all move on, and it goes in a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, given your first-hand experience of working with Vinny, and I suspect I know what you're going to say, yeah, but the media narrative in terms of when he was offered the position with Bayern Munich was maybe that he was 6th, 7th, or 8th choice, and he was almost there by default. Like it was, they were sort of clutching at straws now. But knowing what is he a guy that deserves that position on merit? And do you think it's a role that he'll ultimately be able to flourish in, and hopefully for Bayern supporters take them to a Bundesliga title?
I think for me, one thing, like I said with Vinny, and I mentioned it before, is he was so meticulous in his detail and his planning, and he was always set. All of that for me, when I looked at it, and again, personal opinion, but all of that was set for him to go on into a big job and to a big club, a big role. He had 11 years at Man City, arguably the biggest club in the world and the most successful club in the world, and that his drive and his passion for winning and success and trophies, you could see it. It was just ingrained in him, and that's the type of person he was. So I think, in honesty, was a surprise that Bayern Munich came at that time after a relegation season. Yeah, of course we were. I don't think I was the only one in that, and I think, you know, if you got everybody from Burnley Football Club sat here now to say, were you surprised that Vinny got offered the Bayern job? I think they would say, yeah, at that moment, at that time. But for me personally, looking at it, it isn't a surprise that he is at a big club because, like I said, his devotion to his work, his planning, his, you know, his attention to detail was second to none, and that they're the things that are, in my belief, the 1%. You know, that's the elite performance. They're the things that you're talking about. They're the one step beyond, and I've had the pleasure of working with some fantastic managers and managers very similar, you know, in terms of that. But I'm sure that Vinny will go on and be successful there. But football's football. You know, if you don't get the results and you don't win the games, then it might not be that story. So we'll see. We'll see how it all pans out.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back again towards the end of 2022. Burnley heading into the enforced winter break with the Qatar World Cup, sitting atop of the championship. I think 3 points clear at that point. And there's two things here. You know, are conversations happening behind the scenes about look, you know, we're in with a really good shout of making the Premier League, and then secondly, which was covered, you know, widely in the media, was, you know, that pre-season preparation once that promotion had been confirmed, and the, you know, bringing the players back in, I think it was early June, which was, to throw away a word that we've heard numerous occasions over years, unprecedented, certainly in the public domain. I was just wondering, you know, again, behind the scenes, you know, when those conversations are taking place, when, you know, do you sit down collectively, maybe as a department, to say, right, actually, how are we going to change things up in pre-season? What are we going to do? How will we look to implement it? How are we going to plan it, structure it, and maybe understand a little bit as the rationale and the reasons as to why, you know, the club decided to have or Vinny decided to have a split pre-season, as opposed to your more traditional, maybe, you know, 6 week, 7 week block that, you know, a lot of the clubs tend to have now.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think back. So obviously the championship season was it was a fantastic season, you know, 101 points and absolutely breezed the league in the end. You know, the story wasn't written like that, you know, initially. I remember going into conversations at the club when I first started there, and there was a 3-year plan to return to the Premier League. It wasn't an instant return to the Premier League like we saw, because there was a realism there that there was a massive period of uncertainty in pre-season before I arrived, in terms of they didn't know the squad, they didn't have the players. You know, I think, you know, Vinny turned up and there was six players in the building. He'd lost lots of senior players to clubs, you know, 8 years in the Premier League previous to that. But obviously went into the championship season. It was a slow start. You know, there was, I think we led 10th, 11th at some point in the early couple of months of the season. And then it just kicked into gear. You know, the team just went on this relentless mission of winning games. And so by Christmas time, there was a real realization that, look, you know, there is a possibility, but it's kind of like, it always makes me smile, because it's like nobody was allowed to speak about it. And that was really driven by Vinny. Nobody can speak about promotion. You know, even when we got to March, April time, when it was looking certain, you know, and there was no doubt about it, was looking certain at that point. We were so far clear in the league. But there was nobody was allowed to mention promotion in the building. Nobody was allowed to talk about it. Obviously, behind the scenes, away from the group of staff in the building and the staff that are on the ground delivering every day, and the players, away from all of that, there was obviously conversations and plans going on of going, right, okay, if it is promotion, what does that look like? How are we going to shape? What does the team look like? What a structure is going to look like, and all of that kind of stuff. And there were conversations around pre-season, and the difficulty around the pre-season was that it was such a long time from season ending to season starting in the Premier League, because obviously it's an earlier finish for the Championship. I think it was around the 8th of May, somewhere around that period, but it was the first week of May that the season ended. And then you're not back in until 3/4 of the way through August, for the Premier League to begin. So when Vinny looked at that, he was like, we've got a very young playing squad, not experienced, really massively experienced players in there. Some of the experienced players were leaving. It was a small group of experienced players that we had in there. And there was probably a genuine fear of how are these players going to take care of themselves over the off-season. Obviously, we always give off-season plans and we try and track them as best we can. But that was going to be a long, long period of players' expectation to have an off-season plan. So the thought process was bring the group back together for a week and split the off-season into two 4-week periods, in essence, which was 4 weeks of season finishing. Then we came back in first week of June. We had a week, and then we had 4 weeks till we were back in for pre-season to kick into gear. So it was a touch point, really. It was a touch point with players. They still had opportunity to go away, get away on a holiday. They still had opportunity to self-manage with an off-season program, see family, get home. And it was just something that we discussed, thought about, and implemented. And looking back, there was a lot of positives from it. But players always see it as a negative when you take time away from them to bring them back. But in essence, they still had 2 4-week blocks away. So, not in many industries do you get 8 weeks holiday a year.
Yeah, that was going to be my point. One, do you think the profile of the squad almost helped a little bit in bringing those players back early? And also that promotion to the Premier League. They had that sort of carrot dangling at the end of it where they were, especially, although the fixtures wouldn't have been announced, I think it was the opener against Manchester City. What a game to sort of kick off life in the Premier League. And so did that sort of make things a little bit easier? And in the contrast, would that align, say, for example, towards the back end of, conversations last season about, pre-season programming from dropping down into the Championship? Is it a little bit more difficult then to try and maybe implement, or because of the time differences between, the start and ends of the season, then maybe, you don't have to sort of mitigate that risk as much?
Yeah, I mean, change is always easier when you're winning games. It's always easier. And you can sense that, when you're in foot, and Burnley's not the only football club that I've been in that have been successful, relative to the leagues that they were in. But ultimately, you always see your opportunities for change when you're winning games and you are successful, because the place is lifted, everybody's in a positive mindset, positive mood. Everybody wants to support growth, because it's important not to rest on your laurels, in essence, when you are successful, and you've got to develop as well, and you've still got to have periods of development. But it's interesting because we had some very young, inexperienced players and very excellent players and excellent, potential of player, and the recruitment, behind some of those young players that were brought in was superb, and it was fantastic. So I suppose they didn't have any real preconceptions of English football and what a typical off-season looked like, and that probably made things a little bit easier. I think if you got a group of, English players, 25 plus, who are used to doing it a certain way, then it's more difficult sell, to sell that to the player, to say that this is going to be a real positive, bringing the group back together. Obviously, going down to the Championship, I have to say the group of players, generally were very good, and, they were very respondent to things that you wanted them to do. We had a couple of players that had just returned from long-term injury at the back end of of the relegation season, that we coordinated with, you know, support that they had outside of the club, whether it was fitness coaches, conditioners, physios, and coordinated a continuation of work, which has allowed them to come back in and play. And one of those players played, you know, the other night at Luton, and looked very good and looked sharp and looked fit, which was good to see. So they were really responding to those things that you wanted to do. Listen, do you always get every player on board and sell it to every player? No, there's always grumblings and whinings and moans, and those grumbles, whines and moans increase when you are struggling and you're unsuccessful, because negativity tends to find a bigger voice in those periods. So I think the key to it all is being able to liaise with the player and speak to the player on their level and communicate it with them. You know, there's always a reason why something's being done. And I think if I had a criticism of performance support, sometimes we don't always do that the best, because it's such a fast-paced environment. Everything's 100 mile an hour. Do we always take a step back and go, right, have I spoken to that individual and made sure they're aware that that's going to happen and why it's going to happen? And that's always something that I talk about when I go into clubs, is like, let's do this, let's do it well, let's try and improve this, and let's try and make it better, so that we can get that buy-in from the player, whatever it is we're trying to do.
Early in 23-24, Vinny done an interview, and he was asked the question about his pre-season, and he said, you know, it was one of the best decisions I made, just in terms of bringing that group of lads together, and wanted to sort of, not just from the physical aspect of getting the lads, you know, fit and ready, but like you say, there was a lot of new faces or young. It was about getting the cohesion of the group and bringing those together and really building up that camaraderie. Towards the, you know, at the end of the season, you know, despite the fact that you were relegated to the Championship, do you look back and just, you know, do you take any positives from that in terms of, you know, what you try to implement in your performances? And sometimes you just hold your hands up and say, look, you know, we were always going to be up against it, regardless of, you know, the performances we put in, where, you know, the jump from that second tier to, you know, that the highest level is huge, and it was always going to be a bit of a push. You know, are you taking any positives from that season, or because you went down, is it, you know, is that tarnished that in any way?
I always try and take a positive out of everything, even if it's the worst case scenario, like a relegation, and we did get relegated. There's lots of learnings. There's lots of things that we look back on and we can improve, you know, individually and collectively as a team and a group of people who are trying to achieve something. I think I had a conversation with a director of performance at another club, you know, not so long ago, and the stat given to me was something like 60% chance of being relegated if you've been promoted, which is huge, you know, for teams. And you look at Leicester, Southampton, and who's the other one who went up? You look at the three that went up. Ipswich. Yeah. You look at the three. That's what they're trying to battle with now. Is that reality of, look, you know, there's a strong possibility of that. There's so many balancing acts around that, because clubs have to act cautiously, so it affects your recruitment, it affects what money you spend, it affects what you're investing into your performance department, your coaching staff, you know, everything around the football club. When I look back onto the, you know, the returning the players for a week in that off season, I take lots of positives out of it. We had a lot of national players away, so it was only a small group, you know, it wasn't the full squad. But we had a lot of returning players from loan as well. We had kids that we'd signed and were sent out to other clubs, so they returned back to the club. So it brought them into the plan, and he outlined within that, survive was the first year, survive. Second year was consolidate, and then third year was to push, and that was his 3-year plan going back into the Premier League. Obviously, we failed at the first year of that hurdle because we didn't survive. And when I look back and I reflect on that season, we started so slowly in that season. You know, there's some things that I take back when I look at the pre-season and the plan that we put together in the pre-season. look at some of the exposures that we got into training. Was it enough? Did it need a little bit more? But there's always a difficult balancing act with your pre-seasons as well, in the fact that you've got international players, they return late, you've not got them for the longer periods that you would like them for. So yeah, it's balanced, but there's lots of positives to take out of it, and then, you know, lots of learning to take out of it. I don't take things as negative and go, oh, that was just rubbish, you know, ditch it. It was done for a reason at the time. You've got to think back to the reason that you did it for, reflect on it. Did it work? Can it be improved? Or does it get ditched? And these are the reasons why it gets ditched, and we progress it on.
You mentioned before that negativity tends to be afforded that you know, the video with Vincent, Vinny, you know, that went viral yesterday. You know, it was that snapshot. It's all geared around generating traffic, generating views. And I suppose in a roundabout way, I'm moving towards, say, the data that we produce and what I produce with Premier Injuries. And Vinny was, in terms of how he would, you know, disclosure and smoke and mirrors. I have to say that Vinny was probably one of the most difficult managers in terms of, you know, his team news updates and what have you, in pretty much press conferences. I think, you know, on occasions he would say, look, if you ask me direct about a player, I will tell you, but I'm not going to do your job for you.
Yeah.
And there were players that were sort of dropping in and dropping out, and, you know, to the best of your ability, you know, you're managing from the outside. And I often wonder, and I have had conversations with various people around different clubs around the data that we produced. How much of a factor does maybe some of that maybe outside media noise, you know, does that impact, or does that, you know, I suppose, feed its way into conversations within the clubs? Or is it, like you say, you know, we don't really follow, to be honest, we're not interested, you know, we know what's happening behind the scenes, and, you know, we're doing the work to our best of our abilities. You know, we understand the full picture, and we try to sort of implement, you know, these protocols to try and achieve, you know, our goals, as, you know, as Vinny has set out, as it was.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was, and Vinny wasn't the only manager that I've worked with that was like this, is that managers and coaches always relate players to themselves when they played, if that makes sense, in terms of like how Vinny and his coaching staff wanted to manage players was articulate because of the injury issues that Vinny had when he was a player. You know, we always engaged in a conversation around Vinny's calves at some point in a season. It always popped up, you know, and that kind of drove how Vinny thought about training management and managing players, you know, in terms of what they did, how they did it. And he was very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? He's very focused on what he needed out of a player and what a player should do and what it needed to do. So there was Bram Gears, who was Vinny's fitness coach. He was kind of my link into Vinny, if that made sense. I would liaise with Bram a lot, and Bram would feed into Vinny, and that's how the relationship kind of worked. But the information that I provided Bram and the conversations myself and Bram would have would then dictate what Vinny would ask of a player. So, and if it was decided that this player should only play 70 minutes, always that player would be pulled off at 70 minutes, always. And he was, you know, almost a little bit autistic in that he would never veer from that. And other managers I've worked with, when you know, when the game's on a balance or it's on a knife edge, would just continue or just keep playing that player because they feel like it might change the balance of the game. Vinny was very, very, always stuck to his plan. I think that's probably the best way of describing him. If Vinny had a plan, that's what was going to happen. And he never veered away from that plan. It was always the same plan. So if he planned 2 weeks ago that a player wasn't playing in a particular game, that player wouldn't play in that particular game. And actually, a lot of the time, even if something happened, an injury got picked up for another player or somebody else wasn't available because they'd been sent off, that player's plan wouldn't change. He would find another way. And we always used to talk about those things. Meetings always centered around those things: is what's the plan? How are we planning? What does it look like? And we go through cycles of like looking at 12 weeks in advance, in essence. So the 12-week plan was set, and very rarely did it veer. If it veered, it only veered for an extreme reason, in essence. And that's how
Yeah.
Vinny works.
Yeah, I heard a similar story with regards to Rafa Benitez, and almost that, he was picking that starting 11 4, 5, 6 weeks in advance, and barring, any extenuating circumstances, you would very rarely sort of veer from that. Those thought patterns and philosophies. Everything was done for a reason. Do you think that the fact that Burnley were, in the grand scheme of the Premier League, were working with a much smaller budget, had smaller squads, and therefore pressures on trying to ensure player availability, optimize performance was a little bit greater. Therefore, when the science comes into it and you're saying, look, this is what that player can give you this game, after that, we're maybe moving into that red zone where maybe, we're taking unnecessary risks. Is that a factor, in and around and considerations in those conversations about how teams and players are going to set up?
Yeah, always. I mean, Vinny was, he was always engrossed in, what we did and how we did it. And one of the big things, I remember the first conversation I had with him is like, my methods of working are always around what and why, and then we start looking at how. So like, everything we did, data collection, gym programming, planning, everything we did, Vinny wanted to know what was going on, what players were doing, and he'd always catch you cold. He'd always ask for something, when you weren't expecting it. But because we had our processes, because our plan was in place, and it kind of aligned to what he wanted to do, and we worked very hard to do that. He knew that information was there. So, but he also spent a lot of time with data. So any of the data we collected, whether it was strength data, whether it was GPS, whether it was jump data, whatever it was, Vinny would spend time analysing that data himself, even without us sending it or prompting it. We had the platforms that Vinny had access to, and he went on there. So he would always come. And again, this is my opinion, and this is kind of my interpretation of the manager, is that he would always come with preloaded questions around things, in terms of like, because he'd done his digging and he'd done his research in terms of what he thought it was going to be. Did they always align? No. But so long as there was a rationalized conversation around it and there was justification around it, it wasn't just a subjective opinion all the time, then he would get on board. Sometimes he'd go, right, I've heard you, and I'm going to go this way for this reason. But he always knew where you stood. And that's what I really liked about it, is because he was so meticulous, it made you be better as well, because you knew you had to be absolutely on point with everything that you did. Otherwise, you were going to get caught out, which fortunately I am a bit of I am a perfectionist in terms of like that. I'm always searching for perfection, but I know the reality is you never get there. But I'm always pushing and driving and looking at different ways of doing things and how we do things. And we had lots of conversations about lots of different things, but ultimately it goes back to that attention to detail again, and that's what drove everybody in the building, because you always had to be on point.
Excellent. So David Rhodes, formerly of Burnley Football Club, what does the future hold for you now, David?
I've had
the $1 million question.
Yeah, honestly, if you could tell me, Ben, that'd be great. I'd love to know. I've had so many conversations with so many good people. I have had a couple of offers that I've looked at. One I have turned down. One is ongoing at this moment in time. So yeah, genuinely don't know. You know, I have a passion for building things. I have a passion for leading. I have a passion for working with people and building teams, and ultimately that's kind of where you see yourself. But the reality of that is there's not that many jobs in football to do that. You know, in the Premier League, you're talking about 20 jobs. So who knows? Who knows where it'll go? We'll see.
And ideally, is it to remain within football, or have you ever thought about, spreading your wings and moving into other areas of elite sport?
I've never ever had the opportunity to move into other areas of elite sport, and probably through my fault of not searching for those opportunities. You know, football's what I've known and what I've been comfortable with. And actually, if I was giving somebody advice to myself, if I was advising myself 20 years ago, I would say go and try different things and go into, maybe rugby or cricket or athletics or whatever it is. So yeah, I wouldn't rule that out. It's definitely an option. There's lots of good elite sport environments which I think I can add value to. So yeah, we'll see where conversations go.
Yeah, I mean, fingers crossed. Hopefully, this platform can help sort of elevate that and maybe showcase your skills and you as a person, like I say, to other people in other sports. Although I'm sure your CV more than does that and speaks volumes for the work that you've done. David, it's been absolutely fantastic chatting. I've loved having a conversation and hearing about your time with Burnley. I suspect we could go on for hours and hours talking about your life and times at the highest level. But for now, like I say, I know you're an extremely busy guy, so I'd like to thank you for coming along. Really appreciate all your time, and yeah, look, if there's anything that we can do in the future, by all means, reach out. If there's anything that you want to add in terms of any social media channels or anything that you're doing in terms of work, please feel happy, to mention those or reach out further down the line.
Ben, thank you very much. Thanks for the invite. Really enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Thanks, David.
Take care.